In the late 1800s, a lone explorer descended into the Missouri Karst and found something that shouldn't exist. He documented floating, self-illuminating orbs that defied every known law of physics. Are these ancient anomalies still drifting through the Ozark abyss today, or did he discover something far more sentient? The Ozark Mountains have always held their secrets close. Beneath the rolling hills and dense forests of Missouri lies a labyrinth of limestone caverns, carved over millions of years by water and time. Most of these subterranean passages remain unexplored even today, their depths unfathomed, their chambers untouched by human eyes. But in the autumn of 1889, one man ventured into this underground wilderness and emerged with a story so extraordinary that it challenges our understanding of the natural world. His name was Samuel Arterbury, though history has nearly forgotten him. He was not a famous geologist or a celebrated scientist. He was a surveyor by trade, tasked with mapping potential mining sites in the remote regions of southern Missouri. What he found in those depths was never meant for his official reports. Instead, he filled private journals with frantic sketches and desperate descriptions of phenomena that he himself could barely comprehend. Arterbury wrote of chambers where darkness gave way to a soft, pulsating luminescence. He described spheres of light, each roughly the size of a human head, floating freely through the air with purposeful movement. These orbs emitted no heat, produced no sound, and seemed to respond to his presence with what he could only describe as awareness. They moved when he moved. They dimmed when he shouted. They gathered when he stood still, as if observing him with the same curiosity he observed them. For over a century, these journals were dismissed as the fever dreams of a man who had spent too long in the oxygen-deprived depths. But recent discoveries in the Missouri Karst, combined with advanced geological surveys and persistent reports from modern cavers, have forced us to reconsider Arterbury's account. What if he truly saw something down there? What if those glowing spheres were not hallucinations, but real phenomena that continue to drift through the Ozark abyss to this very day? Before we descend into this mystery, if you find yourself captivated by the hidden histories that sleep beneath our feet, subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us continue exploring the forgotten corners of our world. Tonight, we follow Samuel Arterbury into the depths. We examine his detailed observations through the lens of modern science. We consider explanations ranging from rare bioluminescent organisms to tectonic energy releases, from atmospheric anomalies to theories that push the boundaries of known physics. And we ask the question that haunted Arterbury until his death in 1907: what truly dwells in those phosphorescent chambers beneath the Ozark Mountains? The autumn of 1889 was unseasonably warm in southern Missouri. The leaves had begun their transformation, painting the Ozark Hills in shades of amber and crimson, but the air still carried the lingering heat of summer. Samuel Arterbury arrived in the small settlement of Howard's Ridge on September 23rd, carrying with him the equipment of his trade. Surveying chains, a compass, notebooks, pencils, rope, and a dozen candles wrapped in oilcloth, Howard's Ridge no longer exists on any map. It was a temporary mining camp, one of dozens that sprang up in the Ozarks during the late 1800s as prospectors searched for lead, zinc, and other valuable minerals hidden within the limestone bedrock. The camp consisted of perhaps 20 rough-hewn cabins, a general store, and a population that fluctuated with the seasons and the success of nearby claims. Arterbury's assignment was straightforward. He was to survey 3 specific tracts of land southwest of the main camp, document any cave openings or sinkholes, and assess the geological promise of the region for the Missouri Mineral Exploration Company. It was routine work, the kind he had performed dozens of times before across Arkansas, Missouri, and northern Oklahoma. His journal from those first few days contains mundane observations, notes about property boundaries, measurements of surface features, complaints about the September heat and the swarms of gnats that plagued him as he worked through the dense undergrowth. There is nothing in these early entries to suggest what was coming. On September 27th, Arterbury documented finding a sinkhole approximately 40 feet in diameter on the western edge of his survey area. The opening descended at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of sunlight. He noted that cool air flowed from the opening, suggesting substantial cavern systems below. This was significant. Such airflow often indicated commercially viable cave networks that might contain mineral deposits. He marked the location carefully on his map and made plans to descend the following day. Cave exploration was not technically part of his survey duties, but it was understood that any surveyor worth his pay would conduct preliminary investigations of promising openings. The more information he could provide, the more valuable his report would be to the company. On the morning of September 28th, Arterbury prepared for his descent. He recorded his preparations with characteristic precision. He secured 150 feet of manila rope to a sturdy oak tree near the sinkhole entrance. He filled his canteen with fresh water from a nearby spring. He loaded his satchel with candles, matches kept dry in a tin container, his compass, a ball of twine for marking his route, and 2 notebooks for documenting his findings. The temperature that morning was already climbing toward 80 degrees, but Arterbury noted that the air flowing from the cave entrance was noticeably cool, perhaps in the mid-50s. He estimated the sinkhole descended at roughly a 45-degree angle for the first 30 feet before the passage appeared to level out. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, Samuel Arterbury lowered himself into the opening and began his descent into the Missouri Karst. He could not have known that he was about to encounter something that would consume the rest of his life, something that would fill his private journals with increasingly frantic observations and theories, something that science still struggles to explain over a century later. The descent itself was uneventful. Arterbury's experience showed in his careful documentation of the passage. The limestone walls were damp but not dangerously slick. The angle of descent gradually decreased until he found himself in a horizontal passage approximately 6 feet high and perhaps 8 feet wide. The floor was covered with a thin layer of fine silt, undisturbed except for the tracks of small animals, likely raccoons or opossums that had ventured into the entrance chamber. He lit his first candle and proceeded deeper into the passage. The air remained cool and fresh, confirmation of the extensive cave system he had suspected. After approximately 200 paces, carefully counted and noted in his journal, the passage opened into a larger chamber. This first chamber was unremarkable by the standards of Ozark caverns. Arterbury estimated it at roughly 60 feet across, with a ceiling that rose perhaps 20 feet overhead. Modest formations of flowstone covered portions of the walls, and he noted several small stalactites, none longer than a foot, hanging from the ceiling. A narrow stream ran along the eastern wall, disappearing into a low passage too small for human navigation. But Arterbury was not interested in the stream passage. His attention had been caught by a larger opening on the far side of the chamber, a passage that sloped downward into deeper darkness. The cool breeze he had felt at the surface entrance was flowing from this passage, suggesting it connected to substantial caverns below. He crossed the chamber, his candle casting dancing shadows on the limestone walls. At the entrance to the descending passage, he paused to tie a length of twine to a protruding rock, the first marker in what he intended to be a trail he could follow back to the surface. This was standard practice for solo cave exploration in the 19th century, a simple but effective method of navigation in the absolute darkness of unexplored caverns. The descending passage was steeper than the entrance tunnel, and Arterbury estimated he was dropping approximately 1 foot in elevation for every 3 feet of horizontal distance. The walls here showed evidence of significant water flow in the distant past. The limestone was carved into smooth, flowing shapes, and the floor was covered not with silt, but with worn gravel, rounded by ancient currents. After what he estimated to be another 300 paces, the passage opened into a second chamber, and it was here that Arterbury first noticed something unusual. He described it in his journal entry for September 28th as a faint glow emanating from a passage on the far side of the chamber, barely visible in the darkness beyond his candle's reach. At first, he assumed it was simply the reflection of his own light, perhaps bouncing off water or a particularly reflective mineral formation. But when he shielded his candle with his hand, the glow remained, a soft, barely perceptible luminescence that seemed to pulse gently, like the rhythm of slow breathing. Arterbury's training was in engineering and mathematics, not in geology or biology, but he was familiar with the concept of phosphorescent minerals. Certain compounds, when exposed to light, could store that energy and release it slowly as a faint glow. He theorized that perhaps mineral deposits in the passage ahead were phosphorescing from exposure to some natural light source, though he could not imagine what that source might be so deep beneath the surface. Curiosity overcoming caution, he moved toward the glowing passage. As he approached, the luminescence seemed to intensify slightly, though it remained dim, barely sufficient to distinguish the rough outline of the passage walls. The glow had a greenish-blue quality, similar to foxfire, the bioluminescent fungus that sometimes grew on rotting wood in the forest above. The passage descended sharply, and Arterbury found himself using his hands as much as his feet to navigate the steep slope. The stone beneath his fingers was smooth and cool, worn by water over unimaginable spans of time. The glow ahead continued to brighten, no longer a faint suggestion, but a definite illumination, as if he were approaching a chamber lit by a dozen dim lanterns. Approximately 50 feet down the sloping passage, Arterbury emerged into a chamber unlike anything in his previous experience. He would later fill 6 full pages of his journal attempting to describe what he saw, crossing out words, starting again, struggling to capture the scene before him with mere language. The chamber was vast. Even with the strange illumination that filled it, he could not clearly see the far walls or the ceiling. The light came not from any single source, but seemed to emanate from the air itself, a soft, pervasive glow that rendered everything in shades of blue-green twilight. It was bright enough that he could see without his candle, though not bright enough to reveal fine details beyond perhaps 30 feet. But it was not the size of the chamber or even the mysterious illumination that held Arterbury transfixed at the passage entrance. It was the orbs. Throughout the chamber, at various heights from the floor to what he could see of the ceiling, spheres of light drifted slowly through the air. Each was roughly the size of a human head, perhaps 8 to 10 inches in diameter. They glowed with a soft, internal luminescence that was noticeably brighter than the ambient light filling the chamber. He counted 17 of them in his initial survey, though he noted that the number seemed to change as some drifted out of view, while others emerged from the darkness at the chamber's edges. The orbs moved with what Arterbury described as purposeful grace. They did not float randomly like soap bubbles caught in air currents. Instead, they traced smooth, curving paths through the space, sometimes approaching each other, sometimes diverging, sometimes hovering nearly motionless for long moments before resuming their drift. Arterbury stood at the passage entrance for what he estimated to be 20 minutes, simply watching. His scientific training urged him to observe carefully before interacting, to document what existed in its natural state before his presence altered it. He noted that the orbs seemed to follow consistent patterns in their movement, returning to similar locations in what might be regular cycles. He observed that they occasionally pulsed slightly brighter, their light intensifying for a moment before returning to the baseline glow. And then one of the orbs began moving toward him. It approached slowly, gracefully, following a gently curving path that brought it to within perhaps 6 feet of where Arterbury stood. He described his heart pounding in his chest, though whether from fear or excitement he could not say. The orb hovered before him, its light pulsing gently, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and mystery regarded each other in the phosphorescent darkness. Arterbury later wrote that he felt certain, in that moment, that the orb was aware of him. Not in the way a mindless organism might react to stimuli, but with genuine consciousness, genuine curiosity. It was studying him just as he was studying it. He slowly extended his hand toward the orb, moving with careful deliberation. The orb retreated slightly, maintaining its distance, then drifted to the left as if to examine him from a different angle. Arterbury turned to follow its movement, and the orb completed a full circle around him before returning to its original position. Then it pulsed brightly 3 times in rapid succession and drifted away, rejoining the slow dance of light in the chamber's depths. Samuel Arterbury had descended into the Missouri Karst to survey land for mineral deposits. Instead, he had discovered something that defied every framework of understanding available to a man of the late 19th century. He could not have known that this discovery would consume the remaining 18 years of his life, that he would return to this chamber dozens of times, filling journal after journal with observations and theories, or that he would die without ever understanding what he had truly found in the phosphorescent depths. He only knew, standing in that luminous chamber on the morning of September 28, 1889, that the world was far stranger than he had ever imagined, and that he had been granted a glimpse of that strangeness in its purest form. What happened next would test the limits of his sanity and challenge the boundaries of accepted science. Samuel Arterbury did not immediately flee from the phosphorescent chamber. Despite the strangeness of what he was witnessing, despite every instinct that might have urged him to retreat to the familiar world above, he remained. His training as a surveyor had instilled in him a methodical approach to the unknown. Observe, measure, document, analyze. These were the tools of his profession, and he applied them now to phenomena that his profession had never prepared him to encounter. He found a relatively flat outcropping of limestone near the passage entrance and sat down, withdrawing his notebook and pencil. For the next several hours, he watched and recorded. The initial shock of discovery gave way to systematic observation, and it is this transition, preserved in his journals, that lends such credibility to his account. A man inventing a fantasy would likely fill his pages with breathless wonder and supernatural interpretation. Arterbury instead filled his pages with measurements, sketches, and careful notation of patterns. His first detailed entry, written in the flickering light of the phosphorescent chamber, describes the physical characteristics of the orbs with precise attention to detail. Each sphere appeared to be approximately 9 inches in diameter, with a variation of perhaps an inch in either direction. The largest orb he observed measured what he estimated to be 11 inches across, while the smallest was perhaps 7 inches. He noted this variation carefully, wondering if it indicated different ages, different types, or simply individual variation within a single phenomenon. The surface of each orb was not smooth, but appeared to have a subtle texture, like frosted glass or the surface of a pearl. The light emanated from within, not from the surface itself, giving each sphere a quality of depth, as if one were looking into a luminous volume rather than at an illuminated surface. Arterbury attempted to sketch this quality, filling a page with circular drawings annotated with notes about gradations of brightness from center to edge. The color of the light was predominantly blue-green, what he described as the color of shallow ocean water in bright sunlight, though he admitted he had only seen such water once during a brief trip to the Gulf of Mexico in his youth. But within this primary hue, he observed subtle variations. Some orbs carried a hint of violet in their luminescence. Others leaned more toward pure green. One orb, which he watched for nearly an hour, seemed to shift slowly through a range of colors, moving from blue-green to pure blue to a deep aquamarine before cycling back again. The intensity of the light also varied. At their baseline state, The orbs provided enough illumination to see clearly within a radius of perhaps 10 to 15 feet. But they underwent periodic pulsations, brightening noticeably for 2 to 3 seconds before returning to their normal glow. Arterbury timed these pulsations carefully with his pocket watch and noted that they did not occur randomly. Each orb seemed to pulse at regular intervals, though the intervals differed from one orb to another. The orb he had designated in his notes as number 1 pulsed every 43 seconds with remarkable consistency. Number 2, a slightly larger sphere that drifted along the western wall of the chamber, pulsed every 71 seconds. Number 3, which remained nearly stationary near the center of the visible space, pulsed every 37 seconds. He documented the pulse intervals of 12 different orbs, finding no 2 that matched exactly. Even more intriguing was his observation that occasionally 2 or more orbs would pulse in synchronization, their lights brightening simultaneously despite their different individual rhythms. When this occurred, the combined illumination was sufficient to reveal more of the vast chamber around him. In these brief moments of enhanced light, Arterbury glimpsed massive formations of flowstone cascading down distant walls, saw the vague suggestion of passages leading from the chamber in multiple directions, and perceived that the ceiling was far higher than he had initially estimated, perhaps 80 or even 100 feet above the chamber floor. But it was the movement of the orbs that most captivated Arterbury's attention. These were not objects simply drifting on air currents. The chamber was nearly still, the air cool but undisturbed by significant flow. Yet the orbs moved with what he could only describe as intention. He documented several distinct patterns of movement. The most common was what he termed the patrol pattern. An orb would trace a roughly circular or elliptical path through a section of the chamber, returning to approximately the same position every several minutes. The paths were not perfectly regular, varying slightly with each cycle, but they were consistent enough that Arterbury could predict with reasonable accuracy where a given orb would be at a given time. The second pattern he called the drift. Some orbs moved in long, slow trajectories across the chamber, traveling from one side to the other over the course of 10 or 15 minutes before reversing direction or altering their course. These drifting orbs seemed to move at a consistent speed, which he estimated at roughly 1 foot every 3 seconds, or about 20 feet per minute. The third pattern was the most unsettling. Some orbs would remain nearly motionless for extended periods, hovering in place with only minor adjustments to their position, and then suddenly accelerate to several times their normal speed, crossing 30 or 40 feet in a matter of seconds before resuming their slow drift. This rapid movement was not random. In every case Arterbury observed, it appeared to be a response to something, though he struggled to identify the trigger. After approximately 3 hours of observation from his position near the passage entrance, Arterbury decided to test whether the orbs would react to his movement. He stood slowly and took several careful steps into the chamber. Immediately, the 3 nearest orbs altered their patterns. 2 of them moved away, increasing their distance from him while maintaining their general patrol patterns. The third, however, approached. This orb, which he had designated as number 4 in his notes, drifted toward him with what he described as unmistakable deliberation. It approached to within 5 feet and then began to circle him, exactly as the first orb had done when he initially entered the chamber. Arterbury stood motionless, watching the sphere complete 3 full circles around him at a consistent distance and height, approximately at the level of his chest. Then he attempted something that might have seemed foolish, but which he felt compelled to try. He spoke to it. "Good evening," he said, his voice sounding strange and flat in the vast chamber. His words seemed to be absorbed by the space rather than echoing as they would in the smaller caves he had explored. The orb's response was immediate and unmistakable. Its light pulsed rapidly, 5 or 6 times in quick succession, far faster than the regular pulsations he had been documenting. Then it retreated several feet, as if startled. Arterbury felt his heart racing. He tried again, this time speaking more softly. "I mean you no harm," he said, feeling absurd even as the words left his mouth, talking to a sphere of light as if it were a sentient being. Again, the rapid pulsing, but this time the orb did not retreat. Instead, it drifted slowly back and forth, a movement Arterbury had not observed before, almost like the swaying of a person shifting their weight from foot to foot. He spent the next hour conducting what he described in his journal as communication experiments. He discovered that the orbs reacted to sound, but not to all sounds equally. When he clapped his hands sharply, every visible orb pulsed brightly and moved rapidly away from him, retreating to the far reaches of the chamber. When he spoke in a normal conversational tone, only the nearest orbs reacted with gentle pulsing. When he whispered, there was no visible reaction at all. Even more intriguing was the discovery that the orbs seemed to differentiate between types of sounds. When he hummed a simple melody, an old hymn he remembered from childhood, 3 orbs approached him, drawing nearer than any had ventured before, to within 3 feet of his position. They swayed gently, their movements almost seeming to follow the rhythm of his humming. When he stopped, they remained close for several moments, their lights pulsing in what might have been expectation before slowly drifting away. Arterbury was a practical man, educated in mathematics and engineering, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural interpretation. But he could not escape the growing conviction that these orbs possessed some form of awareness, some capacity for perception and response that went far beyond simple chemical or physical reactions to stimuli. He decided to test another hypothesis. Moving slowly, he approached the nearest wall of the chamber and examined the limestone surface. It was covered with a thin layer of moisture, as was common in these deep caverns where the humidity remained constant near saturation. He touched the wall and his fingers came away damp, but not particularly wet. He withdrew a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully collected a sample of the moisture, wringing a few drops into a small glass vial he carried for precisely such purposes. He sealed the vial and noted in his journal that he would examine it later in better light to see if it contained any unusual properties or organisms that might explain the luminescence. Next, he examined the air itself. He held up his hand and felt for any movement, any current that might be carrying the orbs along. The air was remarkably still. There was a faint circulation, the natural breathing of the cave system, as temperature differentials created gentle flows, but nothing that could account for the directed movement of the spheres. He withdrew a match from his tin and struck it, holding it up to observe how the flame behaved. It burned steadily, with a normal yellow flame, showing no unusual colors that might indicate the presence of exotic gases. The orbs nearest to the flame pulsed brightly and moved away, apparently reacting to the heat or perhaps to the different quality of light. Temperature was his next consideration. Throughout his time in the chamber, he had noted that the air was comfortably cool, perhaps in the mid-50s Fahrenheit, typical for caves at this depth in the Ozarks. But he wondered if the orbs themselves generated heat. When the nearest orb had approached to within 3 feet during his humming experiment, he had felt no warmth from it, no radiation of energy that might be expected from a source of light. To test this more rigorously, he waited until another orb approached, this time holding perfectly still to encourage it to come near. When it drifted to within 4 feet, he slowly extended his hand toward it, palm forward, moving with glacial slowness to avoid startling it away. The orb retreated slightly, but did not flee. Arterbury continued his slow advance, inching his hand forward over the course of several minutes. When his palm was within approximately 12 inches of the orb's surface, he paused and focused all his attention on any sensation of warmth. There was none. The orb glowed with light sufficient to read by at this distance, yet it radiated no heat whatsoever. This violated every principle of physics Arterbury understood. Light was a form of energy. Energy transfer created heat. An object bright enough to illuminate its surroundings should be warm to some degree. Yet the orb was apparently producing light through some mechanism that generated no waste heat, no thermal radiation. He withdrew his hand and the orb drifted away, resuming its patrol pattern. Arterbury returned to his outcropping and spent the next 20 minutes filling his notebook with observations and preliminary theories, none of which satisfied him. Could the light be produced by living organisms, perhaps colonies of bioluminescent bacteria or fungi suspended in some kind of transparent membrane? Possible, but this failed to explain the orb's responsive behavior and their movement patterns, which showed far more complexity than could be attributed to simple organisms reacting to stimuli. Could they be some form of ball lightning or other electrical phenomenon, sustained by unusual conditions in the cave system? Again possible, but ball lightning was typically short-lived, lasting seconds or at most minutes. These orbs showed no signs of dissipating. Moreover, ball lightning was associated with heat and often with a distinctive smell of ozone. The orbs produced neither. Could they be composed of some gas or vapor that had phosphorescent properties, contained within an invisible membrane or held together by surface tension or electromagnetic forces? This was more plausible, but it still failed to explain the apparent awareness the orbs displayed, their responses to his presence and to sound. Arterbury was reaching the limits of his ability to theorize based on the scientific knowledge available to him in 1889. He was a surveyor, not a physicist or a biologist. He could observe and document, but he lacked the specialized knowledge to explain what he was seeing in terms of established scientific principles. What he did possess, however, was persistence and methodical discipline. He decided that he would return to this chamber as many times as necessary to gather sufficient data that perhaps someone with greater scientific expertise could make sense of it. He would document everything, measure everything, test every hypothesis he could devise. But first, he needed to address a practical concern. He had been in the cave system for over 4 hours, and his initial candle had long since burned down. He had lit 2 more during his observations, and he estimated he had perhaps 6 candles remaining in his satchel. Moreover, he was growing hungry and thirsty, having brought only a single canteen and no food, as he had expected this to be a brief preliminary survey. He stood and began to make his way back toward the passage that led to the upper chambers and eventually to the surface. As he moved, several orbs altered their patterns to track his movement. When he reached the passage entrance and turned for one last look at the phosphorescent chamber, he counted 9 orbs that had positioned themselves in a rough semicircle, perhaps 20 feet away, as if they had gathered to watch his departure. He raised his hand in what felt like an absurd gesture of farewell. Every orb pulsed brightly in unison. The journey back to the surface was uneventful. Arterbury followed his twine markers through the upper chambers and eventually emerged from the sinkhole entrance into the late afternoon sunlight. He estimated it was approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had been underground for roughly 6 hours. The surface world seemed strange to him after the timeless darkness of the cave. The heat of the September afternoon, the bright sunlight filtering through the oak and hickory canopy, the sound of birds and insects, all of it felt almost alien after hours in the silent, cool, phosphorescent depths. He made his way back to his camp, a simple tent pitched near a spring about half a mile from the sinkhole entrance. He ate a cold meal of hardtack and dried beef, drank deeply from the spring, and then sat down to organize his notes while the observations were still fresh in his mind. He spent the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening transcribing his rough notes into a more organized format, creating detailed sketches of the chamber layout and the orbs, and beginning to develop a systematic plan for future explorations. He would need better equipment, more time, and ideally, a witness to confirm that what he was seeing was real and not some hallucination brought on by bad air or exhaustion. But even as he wrote, doubt crept in. How could he explain this to anyone? Who would believe him if he described floating, luminous spheres that responded to sound and seemed to display awareness? He would be dismissed as mad or as a fraud seeking attention. He decided, for the moment, to tell no one. He would continue his official survey work, documenting the land features and geological characteristics that the Missouri Mineral Exploration Company had hired him to assess. But in his private time, he would return to the chamber and continue his study of the orbs. He would gather enough evidence, enough detailed observations, that eventually he could present findings that could not be dismissed. That evening, sitting by his campfire as darkness fell over the Ozark Hills, Samuel Arterbury made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would devote himself to understanding the orbs. He would unlock their mystery or die trying. He had no way of knowing that the mystery would prove deeper than he could imagine, that the orbs were only the first layer of strangeness in the phosphorescent depths, and that his investigations would lead him to conclusions that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The next morning, September 29th, Arterbury rose before dawn and returned to the sinkhole entrance. This time he was better prepared. He carried food and extra water, a dozen additional candles, more rope, and a second notebook dedicated exclusively to his observations of the orbs. He also carried a small wooden box containing a thermometer, several empty vials for collecting samples, and a lodestone to test for magnetic properties. The descent was familiar now, almost routine. He moved through the upper chambers quickly, pausing only to refresh his twine markers. When he emerged into the phosphorescent chamber, he found it exactly as he had left it. The same ambient glow filled the space. The orbs drifted in their patterns, though whether these were the same individual orbs or different ones, he had no way to determine. Over the next several days, Arterbury established a routine. He would spend 8 to 10 hours in the chamber each day, observing, documenting, and conducting careful experiments. He tested the orb's responses to various stimuli. He mapped the chamber more thoroughly, discovering that it was even larger than he had initially estimated, perhaps 200 feet across at its widest point, with multiple passages leading to other chambers that also displayed the same mysterious luminescence. He discovered that the orbs did not remain confined to a single chamber. He observed them drifting through the connecting passages, moving between chambers as if patrolling a larger territory. He followed several orbs through these passages and found additional chambers, each filled with the same blue-green glow, each hosting its own population of luminous spheres. One chamber he discovered contained what he estimated to be over 50 orbs, far more than he had seen in the first chamber. They moved in complex patterns, weaving around each other in what almost resembled a dance. When he entered this chamber, every orb stopped its movement simultaneously and oriented toward him. The effect was profoundly unnerving, like being the focus of attention from dozens of invisible observers. He backed out of that chamber slowly, and the orbs resumed their movements only after he had retreated to the passage. He noted in his journal that perhaps there were limits to how much human presence the orbs would tolerate, boundaries he should be careful not to cross. In another chamber, smaller and more isolated, he found only 3 orbs, but these were noticeably larger than the others he had observed, each perhaps 14 to 16 inches in diameter. They moved more slowly than the smaller orbs, their pulsations following a much longer interval, perhaps 2 to 3 minutes between each pulse. When they did pulse, the light they produced was significantly brighter, enough to reveal fine details of the chamber walls at a distance of 50 feet or more. Arterbury began to develop a classification system for the orbs based on their size, color, pulsation frequency, and behavior patterns. He identified what he termed scouts, smaller, faster-moving orbs that seemed to patrol the chambers and passages. He identified guardians, the larger, slower orbs that tended to remain in specific locations. He identified what he called dancers, orbs that moved in coordinated patterns with other orbs, their paths interweaving in complex geometries. Whether these classifications reflected genuine differences in the orb's nature or purpose, or were simply human pattern recognition imposing order on random variation, he could not determine. But the framework helped him organize his observations and make sense of the complexity he was witnessing. On October 2nd, 4 days after his initial discovery, Arterbury made an observation that would become central to his later theories about the orb's nature. He was conducting an experiment with sound, testing whether the orbs responded differently to different pitches and frequencies. He had been whistling various notes when he hit upon a particular tone, roughly what he estimated to be an A above middle C. Every orb in the chamber reacted simultaneously. They all pulsed brightly in perfect synchronization, 3 rapid pulses in succession. Then they began to move, not randomly, but in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern, all flowing in the same direction toward the far wall of the chamber, where a large passage opened into darkness. Arterbury followed, his pulse quickening with excitement and apprehension. The orbs drifted down the passage, perhaps 20 of them in a loose procession, and he hurried to keep them in sight. The passage descended sharply, and he found himself scrambling down steep slopes of breakdown rock, using his hands to steady himself in the uncertain light. The passage opened into another chamber, and what Arterbury saw there stopped him in his tracks. The far wall of this chamber was covered with markings, not natural formations or mineral deposits, but deliberate marks carved into the limestone, symbols and patterns that were clearly the work of intelligence. The orbs dispersed throughout the chamber, resuming their normal patrol patterns, but Arterbury's attention was fixed on the wall. He approached slowly, holding his candle up to examine the markings more closely. They were weathered, clearly ancient, but still visible. Spirals and circles, zigzag patterns, clusters of dots arranged in geometric configurations. And throughout these abstract patterns, repeated again and again, was a symbol that made Arterbury's blood run cold with its implications. A circle with rays emanating from it. A simple, unmistakable representation of a sphere of light. The orbs had been here for a very long time, long enough that someone, at some point in the distant past, had descended into these chambers and carved representations of them into the living rock, long enough to become part of human awareness in an age before written history. Arterbury spent hours examining the wall, carefully sketching the symbols in his notebook. He found what appeared to be multiple layers of carving, older marks overlaid by newer ones, suggesting that this place had been visited repeatedly over a long span of time. The weathering patterns and the depth of mineral deposits covering some of the marks indicated great age, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years. This discovery transformed Arterbury's understanding of his situation. He was not the first to find the orbs. Others had been here before him in ages past, and they had considered the orbs significant enough to create permanent records of their existence. The implications were staggering. If the orbs had existed for centuries or millennia, they could not be a temporary phenomenon, some unusual but fleeting combination of atmospheric conditions. They were permanent features of these caves, enduring presences in the subterranean darkness. And if they had endured for so long, what did that suggest about their nature? What kind of phenomenon could persist unchanged for such vast stretches of time? These questions would haunt Arterbury for the rest of his life. But on that October day in 1889, standing in a chamber lit by luminous spheres, while examining ancient carvings that depicted those same spheres, he felt the weight of genuine mystery settle upon him. He had discovered something profound, something that connected the present to the deep past, something that challenged the boundaries of natural philosophy and demanded explanation. He would spend the next 18 years seeking that explanation, descending again and again into the phosphorescent depths, filling journal after journal with observations and theories. He would sacrifice his career, his health, and ultimately his life to the mystery of the glowing orbs. But he would never find the answer he sought. The orbs would keep their secrets, drifting through the darkness as they had for uncounted centuries, indifferent to human curiosity, eternal in their strange dance of light in the Missouri abyss. Samuel Arterbury's discovery of the ancient wall carvings fundamentally altered the trajectory of his investigation. What had begun as a curious geological anomaly had become something far more significant, a phenomenon with deep roots in human history, something that had inspired awe or fear or reverence in people who had lived and died long before his time. The weight of this realization pressed upon him during his long walks back to camp through the autumn woods, and it filled his thoughts during the sleepless nights that became increasingly common as October progressed. But Arterbury was, at his core, a man of the 19th century, educated in the principles of scientific rationalism that had defined his era. Despite the strangeness of what he was witnessing, despite the apparent awareness displayed by the orbs and the ancient human response documented in the carvings, he remained convinced that there must be a natural explanation. The universe operated according to laws, principles that could be discovered and understood through careful observation and logical analysis. The orbs, however mysterious, must ultimately conform to these laws. He decided to approach the problem systematically, examining each possible natural explanation in turn, testing hypotheses against his observations, and eliminating those that failed to account for the evidence. If he could not immediately explain the orbs, he could at least determine what they were not, narrowing the field of possibilities until the truth revealed itself. The first hypothesis he examined in detail was bioluminescence. Arterbury was familiar with the general concept of living organisms that produced light. He had read accounts of fireflies and glowworms, of deep-sea fish with luminous organs, of foxfire fungus that caused rotting wood to glow in the darkness of the forest. The natural world contained numerous examples of bioluminescence, and it seemed reasonable that the caves might harbor organisms capable of producing the light he was observing. On October 5th, he descended into the caves with equipment specifically chosen to investigate this possibility. He carried glass vials for collecting samples, a magnifying lens for close examination, a small knife for scraping samples from cave surfaces, and several sheets of clean white paper for spreading samples to examine their properties. He began by collecting samples of the moisture that covered the cave walls throughout the phosphorescent chambers. Using his knife, he carefully scraped the damp film from multiple locations, transferring it to separate vials and labeling each with its location. He collected samples from walls near clusters of orbs, from walls in areas where no orbs were present, from the ceiling of the main chamber, and from the floor near the underground stream he had noted during his first exploration. Next, he collected samples of the air itself, or rather, he attempted to do so by sealing empty vials in different locations throughout the chamber, and then capping them quickly, hoping to trap whatever gases or particles might be present. It was a crude method, but it was the best he could manage with the equipment available to him. He also collected samples of the silt and sediment from the cave floor, the water from the underground stream, and scrapings from several of the mineral formations that covered portions of the walls. If bioluminescent organisms were responsible for the light, they might be present in any of these substrates. The collection process took most of the day, and throughout his work, the orbs maintained their usual patterns, drifting through the chamber with their characteristic grace. Several times, orbs approached him as he worked, hovering nearby as if observing his activities. He spoke to them occasionally, maintaining a one-sided conversation that helped alleviate the oppressive silence of the deep cave. "I am trying to understand you," he said to one orb that had stationed itself approximately 10 feet away, watching him scrape moisture from the wall. "You will forgive me, I hope, if my methods seem intrusive. I mean no harm. I seek only knowledge." The orb pulsed gently but made no other response. Arterbury smiled despite himself. He was talking to a ball of light as if it were a colleague, apologizing for his scientific methodology. The absurdity was not lost on him, yet it felt appropriate somehow, a gesture of respect for the mystery he was investigating. With his samples collected, Arterbury returned to the surface and spent the evening examining them by lamplight in his tent. The results were disappointing. The moisture from the cave walls, when spread on white paper and examined with his magnifying lens, appeared to be simply water with perhaps some dissolved minerals and very fine sediment. He could detect no obvious organisms, no visible fungi or bacteria that might account for luminescence. The water from the underground stream was similarly unremarkable, clear and cold, with no visible life forms beyond a few tiny crustaceans, likely amphipods or isopods common to cave streams throughout the region. These creatures showed no luminescence when he observed them in darkness. The sediment samples contained what he expected: broken down limestone, clay particles, and organic detritus washed in from the surface. Again, nothing that glowed or showed any unusual properties. The air samples, of course, were impossible for him to analyze with any rigor. He opened each vial in darkness to see if any luminescence was visible, but saw nothing unusual. The air from the caves smelled clean and slightly mineral, with none of the sulfurous or chemical odors that might indicate unusual gases. Arterbury was not equipped to perform chemical analyses or microscopic examinations beyond the crude observations his magnifying lens allowed. He knew that his negative results did not definitively rule out bioluminescence. There might be organisms present that were too small for him to see, or that required specific conditions to luminesce, or that were present in the air or water in quantities too small to be detected by his methods. But the bioluminescence hypothesis faced more significant challenges than merely the difficulty of detecting the organisms. It failed to explain the most striking features of the orbs: their consistent size and shape, their coordinated movement patterns, their responsive behavior, and their apparent longevity. Bioluminescent organisms in nature typically produced diffuse light, not concentrated spheres of precise geometry. Fireflies created brief flashes, not sustained glow. Foxfire created patches of dim luminescence on wood surfaces, not floating orbs in midair. Deep-sea fish had luminous organs, but these were parts of the fish's anatomy, not independent entities. For bioluminescence to explain the orbs, one would have to propose organisms that somehow organized themselves into perfect spheres, maintained those formations while moving through the air in coordinated patterns, responded collectively to external stimuli like sound, and persisted for what the wall carvings suggested might be thousands of years. The biological complexity required for such behavior seemed to strain plausibility beyond the breaking point. Moreover, Arterbury had observed no signs of metabolism or life processes associated with the orbs. They produced no waste, left no residue, showed no signs of growth or reproduction, required no apparent source of nutrients or energy. In the week he had been observing them, they had not changed in any way that might indicate biological processes at work. With some reluctance, Arterbury set aside the bioluminescence hypothesis as unlikely to provide a complete explanation. He noted in his journal that he could not entirely rule it out, that perhaps some unknown form of colonial organism might account for some aspects of the phenomenon, but that it seemed inadequate to explain the totality of his observations. The second major hypothesis he investigated was that the orbs were some form of gaseous phenomenon, perhaps related to the geological processes occurring deep beneath the Ozark Plateau. This explanation had considerable appeal. The region was known for its complex geology, with limestone caverns formed by millions of years of water dissolution, faults and fractures that penetrated deep into the Earth's crust, and mineral deposits that indicated significant geological activity in the distant past. Arterbury knew that caves could accumulate various gases. Carbon dioxide was common, produced by the breakdown of organic matter and sometimes by geological processes. Methane could accumulate in caves, produced by decaying organic material or seeping up from deeper formations. Radon, though not well understood in 1889, was present in many caves, produced by the decay of uranium in the surrounding rock. Could the orbs be composed of some gas or combination of gases that had luminescent properties under the specific conditions present in the caves? Could geological processes be releasing gases from deep in the earth that rose through fissures and accumulated in these chambers, creating the glowing spheres he was observing? To investigate this possibility, Arterbury needed to understand more about the geology of the cave system and the physics of the orbs themselves. Over the next several days, he conducted a series of experiments designed to test the gaseous hypothesis. First, he attempted to determine the density of the orbs relative to air. If they were composed of a gas lighter than air, they should tend to rise toward the ceiling. If they were denser than air, they should sink toward the floor. What he observed was that the orbs seemed neutrally buoyant, drifting at various heights without showing any consistent tendency to rise or fall. Some orbs remained near the ceiling, others near the floor, and many drifted through the middle regions of the chamber. Their vertical position seemed to be a matter of their individual movement patterns rather than a response to buoyancy. However, Arterbury recognized that neutral buoyancy did not rule out a gaseous composition. If the gas had a density very close to that of air, or if the orbs contained a mixture of gases that balanced to neutral buoyancy, they could behave exactly as he was observing. Next, he attempted to test whether the orbs were affected by air currents. He created a strong draft by waving his coat vigorously in the air near several orbs. The orbs moved in response, but not in the way that lightweight gas-filled bubbles would move. Instead of being swept along by the current, they seemed to actively resist it, maintaining their positions or moving against the flow of air. When he stopped creating the draft, they resumed their normal movement patterns without the drifting or settling one would expect from objects that had been displaced by air movement. This observation suggested that whatever the orbs were, they possessed some means of self-propulsion or position-keeping that operated independently of air currents. This was difficult to reconcile with the hypothesis that they were simply pockets of luminescent gas. Arterbury also attempted to capture an orb to examine it more closely. This experiment would prove to be one of the most dramatic and revealing of his entire investigation. On October 9th, he descended into the caves carrying a large glass jar, approximately 1 gallon in capacity, with a wide mouth and a tight-fitting lid. His plan was to position the jar in the path of a drifting orb and quickly seal it inside, trapping it for detailed examination. He selected a small orb that was following a predictable patrol pattern in the main chamber, circling a specific area every few minutes. He positioned himself along its path, holding the open jar ready. When the orb drifted near, he carefully moved the jar to intercept it, sliding it into the orb's path as gently as possible. The orb entered the jar. For a brief moment, Arterbury felt a surge of triumph. He had captured one. He began to move the lid to seal the jar, and then everything went wrong. The orb's light suddenly intensified, brightening to a degree he had never witnessed before. It was like looking directly at the sun. Arterbury cried out and turned his face away, his eyes watering from the intense light. The jar grew hot in his hands, hot enough that he nearly dropped it. And then, with a sound like a sharp exhalation of breath, the orb shot out of the jar, moving faster than he had ever seen an orb move, faster than seemed physically possible for an object of its apparent mass. It crossed the entire chamber in less than a second, a streak of brilliant light that left afterimages dancing in Arterbury's vision. It disappeared into one of the far passages, and within moments, every other orb in the chamber had followed, all of them accelerating to that same incredible speed, all of them fleeing from his presence. Arterbury was left standing alone in the chamber, holding his jar, his hands stinging from the heat, his eyes still adjusting to the sudden return of near-total darkness. Only the ambient phosphorescence remained, that dim, sourceless glow that pervaded the chamber even in the absence of the orbs. He set down the jar with trembling hands and sat heavily on a nearby rock. His heart was pounding, and he felt shaken in a way he had not experienced since the initial shock of discovering the orbs. He had frightened them, or angered them, or triggered some defensive response. The orb he had attempted to capture had reacted with what could only be described as violence, though it had not actually harmed him beyond the momentary heat and the blinding flash of light. For over an hour, he sat in the dim chamber, waiting to see if the orbs would return. They did not. The chamber remained empty except for the pervasive glow, and Arterbury began to fear that he had permanently driven them away, that his clumsy attempt at capture had destroyed the trust or tolerance that had allowed him to observe them for the past 2 weeks. Eventually, he made his way back to the surface, profoundly disturbed by what had happened. That night, he barely slept, lying in his tent and replaying the incident in his mind. The heat he had felt, the incredible speed of the orb's escape, the coordinated flight response of all the orbs in the chamber, all of it suggested a level of reactivity and capability that went far beyond what any gaseous phenomenon should possess. Gas did not generate sudden heat without combustion. Gas did not accelerate to such extreme velocities without explosive expansion that should have been audible and violent. Gas did not coordinate group responses across dozens of separate pockets or bubbles. The behavior he had witnessed was more consistent with intelligent flight, a deliberate and coordinated escape from perceived danger. The next morning, October 10th, Arterbury returned to the caves with considerable trepidation. He was not certain what he would find, or whether the orbs would still be present after his transgression. He descended through the upper chambers slowly, dreading the possibility that he would enter the main chamber and find it empty, the orbs gone forever, driven away by his foolish attempt at capture. But when he emerged into the main chamber, they were there. Perhaps not as many as before, and they maintained greater distance from him than they had previously, but they were present, drifting in their patterns, glowing with their characteristic blue-green light. Relief flooded through him. He had not destroyed everything with his recklessness. They had forgiven him, or at least, they had returned despite what he had done. He sat down immediately, making no sudden movements, and spoke aloud to the chamber. "I apologize," he said, his voice quiet and sincere. "That was wrong of me. I will not attempt it again. I ask your tolerance to continue my observations, but I will respect your boundaries. You have my word." Whether the orbs understood him was unknowable, but over the course of the next several hours, they gradually approached more closely, resuming something approaching their previous patterns of interaction. By the end of the day, one orb had approached to within 6 feet of him, a distance that seemed to represent a zone of tolerance, close enough for interaction, but far enough to allow for rapid retreat if necessary. The attempted capture had been a failure in terms of his immediate goal, but it had provided valuable data. The orb had generated significant heat when threatened, suggesting that whatever energy source powered their luminescence could be dramatically increased under stress. They could move at velocities far beyond their normal drifting pace, indicating that their usual slow movement was a choice rather than a limitation. And they could coordinate group responses across the entire population of a chamber, suggesting some form of communication or shared awareness. None of this was consistent with simple pockets of luminescent gas. Gases did not make choices about their movement speed. They did not generate selective heat in response to threats. They did not coordinate defensive responses. Arterbury spent the next week conducting more careful experiments, always mindful of the boundaries he had discovered. He tested the orbs' responses to various stimuli, documenting their reactions in meticulous detail. He observed that they reacted to rapid movements with retreat, but tolerated slow, deliberate motions. They reacted to loud sounds with flight, but approached soft sounds, particularly musical tones. They seemed indifferent to light from his candles, but reacted strongly to the heat of flame, always maintaining distance from any fire source. He also investigated the ambient phosphorescence that filled the chambers even in the absence of the orbs. This dim, sourceless glow was itself an anomaly that required explanation. He examined every surface in the main chamber, looking for minerals or coatings that might be producing the light, but found nothing that seemed adequate to explain it. The limestone walls were typical of Ozark caves, primarily calcium carbonate with some minor mineral impurities. He identified small amounts of iron oxide, creating rust-colored stains in some areas, and trace amounts of manganese producing black dendritic patterns, but nothing that should produce visible luminescence. He tested whether the glow came from the air itself by sealing a jar in the chamber and bringing it to the surface. In the darkness of night, he opened the jar to see if the air inside glowed. It did not. Whatever produced the ambient phosphorescence was not something that could be captured and transporting. He considered whether the glow might be related to the orbs themselves, perhaps some form of residual energy they left behind as they moved through the chambers. To test this, he spent a full day in a chamber where no orbs were present, a small side chamber he had discovered that connected to the main system, but which the orbs seemed to avoid. This chamber had the same ambient glow as the others, despite the absence of any orbs. This suggested that the orbs and the ambient phosphorescence, while possibly related, were separate phenomena. The gaseous hypothesis, like the bioluminescence hypothesis before it, was proving inadequate. While Arterbury could not completely rule out the possibility that unusual gases played some role in the phenomenon, they could not explain the full range of behaviors and properties he was documenting. The orbs displayed too much complexity, too much apparent awareness, too much capability for coordinated response. By mid-October, Arterbury found himself in a position that both excited and troubled him. He had seemingly exhausted the obvious natural explanations for the orbs without finding one that adequately accounted for all his observations. This suggested that either he was missing something fundamental about the phenomenon, or the orbs represented something genuinely novel, a natural process or form of matter that was not described by current scientific understanding. The third possibility, which he was reluctant to even consider, but which kept forcing itself into his thoughts, was that the orbs were not simply natural phenomena at all, that they possessed some form of genuine intelligence or consciousness that placed them outside the normal categories of scientific classification. This possibility terrified him because it opened doors that his rational 19th century worldview was not equipped to handle. If the orbs were conscious, aware, intelligent, then what were they? Were they alive in some form that bore no resemblance to conventional biology? Were they something else entirely, something for which his language and his conceptual frameworks had no adequate terms? These questions led him to begin investigating a third category of explanations, one that drew on geology but pushed into more speculative territory. The Ozark region sat atop complex geological structures, layers of limestone and dolomite deposited over hundreds of millions of years, fractured and folded by ancient tectonic forces. Beneath this sedimentary cap lay older crystalline basement rocks, granites and rhyolites from the deep past. These rocks contained quartz, a mineral known to have unusual electrical properties. Quartz could generate electricity when compressed, a property called piezoelectricity. It could also store energy and release it under certain conditions. Perhaps, Arterbury theorized, the orbs were related to some form of energy storage and release in the quartz-bearing rocks, a geological battery that had been charging for millions of years and was now discharging in the form of the luminous spheres. This theory had the advantage of potentially explaining the longevity suggested by the ancient wall carvings. Geological processes operated on vast timescales. A phenomenon rooted in the fundamental structure and composition of the rock itself could persist for thousands or even millions of years, far longer than any biological process could sustain. To investigate this possibility, Arterbury needed to understand more about the geology beneath the cave system. On October 18th, he spent the day examining the rock formations in and around the caves, collecting samples, mapping fracture patterns, and looking for evidence of the kinds of tectonic stress that might generate piezoelectric effects in quartz-bearing rocks. He found numerous fractures and faults, evidence of the tectonic forces that had shaped the region. He found veins of quartz cutting through the limestone in several locations, milky white streaks of crystalline silica that had been deposited by ancient hydrothermal fluids. He collected samples of these quartz veins, noting their locations and orientations. Back at his camp, he examined the quartz samples, looking for any unusual properties. He struck them together to see if they would produce visible sparks or light, testing whether mechanical stress could trigger luminescence. They produced no visible effect, though he acknowledged that any piezoelectric discharge would likely be too small for him to detect without sensitive instruments. The quartz theory was intriguing but speculative. Even if the bedrock contained energy stored in crystalline structures, the mechanism by which this energy would be released in the form of mobile, responsive, spherical lights remained utterly mysterious. It was replacing one mystery with another, offering a possible energy source, but no explanation for how that energy organized itself into the complex phenomena he was observing. As October drew to a close, Arterbury was forced to acknowledge that he had made little real progress in explaining the orbs. He had gathered extensive documentation, hundreds of pages of observations and sketches. He had tested multiple hypotheses and found all of them wanting. He had established parameters of interaction that allowed him to coexist with the orbs without triggering their flight response. But he was no closer to understanding what they fundamentally were. The rational explanations, bioluminescence, gaseous phenomena, geological energy discharge, all failed to fully account for the evidence. Yet the alternative, that the orbs represented some form of consciousness or intelligence, was so far outside his conceptual framework that he struggled to even formulate hypotheses around it. On October 28th, nearly a month after his initial discovery, Arterbury made a decision. He would expand his investigation beyond the purely physical and chemical properties of the orbs. He would investigate the human dimension of the phenomenon, the history and folklore surrounding these caves, the meaning of the ancient carvings, and any traditional knowledge that might exist among the people who had lived in this region for generations before his arrival. If the orbs had been known to humans in the past, as the carvings clearly indicated, then perhaps there were stories, legends, or oral histories that might provide clues to their nature. It was not the kind of evidence that would satisfy a physicist or a chemist, but Arterbury was beginning to understand that conventional scientific approaches were inadequate to this mystery. He needed to cast his net wider, to consider sources of knowledge that his training had taught him to dismiss. This decision marked a turning point in his investigation. He was moving from pure observation and experimentation into the realm of history, anthropology, and folklore. He was acknowledging that the mystery of the orbs might not yield to the methods of physical science alone, that understanding them might require a different kind of inquiry altogether. What he would discover in the folklore and traditions of the Ozark region would both enlighten and disturb him, opening new avenues of interpretation while raising questions even more profound than those he had already encountered. The orbs, he would learn, had been known by many names over the centuries, and the stories told about them painted a picture far stranger than he had imagined. But that investigation would have to wait for his return from the surface world. His supplies were running low, his notebooks were nearly full, and he had been away from civilization for nearly a month. He needed to return to the nearest town, reprovision, and perhaps most importantly, send a report to the Missouri Mineral Exploration Company explaining why his survey work had progressed so slowly. On October 30th, Samuel Arterbury emerged from the caves for what he intended to be a brief hiatus. He cached his remaining supplies near the sinkhole entrance, carefully concealing them from any potential passers-by. He took one last look at the dark opening that led down to the phosphorescent chambers, feeling an unexpected reluctance to leave. In just 1 month, the caves and their mysterious inhabitants had become the center of his existence. The surface world seemed less real to him now, less substantial than the glowing chambers beneath the earth. He felt the pull of the mystery like a physical force, a gravity that drew him downward into the darkness. But he turned away and began the walk back to Howard's Ridge, his pack heavy with notebooks and rock samples, his mind already planning his return. He did not know it yet, but he would spend the rest of his life returning to these caves, descending again and again into the phosphorescent depths, seeking answers that would always remain just beyond his reach. The Orbs had claimed him, as surely as they had claimed the ancient peoples who had carved their images into the cave walls centuries before. He belonged to the mystery now, and the mystery would not let him go. Samuel Arterbury arrived in the town of West Plains, Missouri, on November 2nd, 1889, after 3 days of travel from the remote cave site. West Plains was the nearest substantial settlement, a town of perhaps 1,500 inhabitants that served as a commercial hub for the surrounding Ozark region. It had a proper hotel, several general stores, a bank, a telegraph office, and most importantly for Arterbury's purposes, a small but respectable library housed in the courthouse building. He checked into the Ozark Hotel, a 2-story wooden structure on the main street, and spent his first evening in civilization simply adjusting to the presence of other people. After a month of solitude, broken only by his one-sided conversations with the Orbs, the noise and bustle of even a small frontier town felt overwhelming. Voices in the hallway, footsteps on the floor above, the clatter of dishes from the dining room, all of it seemed jarringly loud and intrusive. That night, he organized his notes and began the unpleasant task of preparing a report for the Missouri Mineral Exploration Company. He had been hired to survey specific tracts of land for mineral potential, and he had instead spent a month investigating a phenomenon that had no commercial value whatsoever. He needed to provide some justification for his lack of progress on the assigned work. In the end, he produced a brief, technical report documenting the surface features of the survey area, noting the presence of extensive cave systems that would make mining operations challenging, and recommending that the company focus its attention on other, more geologically stable properties. It was not entirely dishonest, merely incomplete. He made no mention of the phosphorescent chambers or the orbs. That investigation remained his private obsession, something he was not yet ready to expose to official scrutiny or public skepticism. He sent the report by telegraph the following morning, along with a request for a 2-month extension of his contract to complete more detailed surveys of the region. To his relief, the company agreed, apparently satisfied with his preliminary findings. This bought him time to continue his investigation without the immediate pressure of employment obligations. With his professional duties temporarily satisfied, Arterbury turned his attention to the historical and folkloric research he had planned. He began at the courthouse library, a single room containing perhaps 200 books and a collection of local newspapers dating back to the town's founding in 1858. The librarian, a thin, elderly woman named Mrs. Hardesty, regarded him with polite curiosity as he explained his interest in local history and traditions. "I am conducting research on the early settlement of the region," he told her, which was true enough. "I am particularly interested in stories and accounts relating to the cave systems in the area and any traditions or folklore associated with them." Mrs. Hardesty directed him to several volumes of local history and memoirs, and over the next several days, Arterbury immersed himself in the written record of the Ozark region. What he found was fascinating but frustratingly incomplete. The written history of the area was relatively recent, dating back only to the early 1800s, when American settlers began moving into the region in significant numbers. Before that, the area had been home to various Native American groups, but their histories existed primarily in oral tradition rather than written records. He did find several references to caves in the early settler accounts. The Ozarks were riddled with caverns, and the pioneers had used them for various purposes: cold storage for food, shelter during storms, sources of saltpeter for gunpowder production. Several accounts mentioned strange experiences in certain caves, feelings of unease or presence, unusual sounds, cold spots that seemed to move, but nothing that explicitly described the orbs. The closest he came to a relevant account was a memoir written in 1867 by a settler named Jacob Thornton, who described exploring a cave system southwest of West Plains in the 1820s. Thornton wrote of reaching a deep chamber where the darkness seemed less than absolute, where he could see dimly despite his torch having burned out. He attributed this to some trick of reflected light or perhaps phosphorescent minerals, and he noted that he had felt profoundly uncomfortable in that chamber, as if he were being watched by unseen eyes. He had left quickly and never returned, warning others away from that particular cave. Arterbury copied this account carefully into his notebook. The location Thornton described was not far from the cave system where Arterbury had discovered the orbs. It was possible, even likely, that Thornton had encountered the same phenomenon, though he had either not seen the orbs themselves or had chosen not to describe them in detail. The written record, while intriguing, was too sparse and too recent to provide the depth of information Arterbury sought. If he wanted to access older knowledge about the caves and their mysteries, he would need to find sources that existed outside the written tradition. He would need to speak with people who carried oral histories passed down through generations, who knew the land through lived experience rather than through books and documents. Mrs. Hardesty, when he explained this to her, suggested he speak with several of the older residents of the area, particularly those who had grown up in the region before the Civil War. She also mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, that there were Cherokee families in the area who might have knowledge of older traditions, though she cautioned that they were often reluctant to share such knowledge with outsiders. Arterbury spent the next 2 weeks traveling through the countryside around West Plains, introducing himself to the longtime residents and asking about their knowledge of local caves and any stories or traditions associated with them. It was slow, often frustrating work. Many people were suspicious of his motives, wondering why a surveyor would be asking about old stories. Others simply had nothing to tell him, their knowledge limited to the practical uses of nearby caves for storage or shelter. But gradually, carefully, he began to assemble fragments of folklore and oral tradition that painted a picture of beliefs about the caves that stretched back beyond living memory. An elderly farmer named Silas Crawford, who had settled in the region in 1819, told him that the old-timers, the first American settlers, had spoken of certain caves being sacred or forbidden places, though he could not recall the specific reasons for this designation. A woman named Martha Keene, who must have been in her 80s, remembered her grandmother speaking of lights in the hills, mysterious glows that would sometimes be visible at night near certain cave entrances. Her grandmother had called them spirit lights and had said they were older than the Cherokee, older than any people, remnants of the first days of creation. These fragments were tantalizing but vague, the kind of half-remembered folklore that had been diluted and distorted through multiple generations of retelling. Arterbury needed something more substantial, more direct. He needed to speak with someone who had actual knowledge of the traditions rather than merely distant memories of stories once told. His opportunity came in late November when Mrs. Hardesty mentioned that there was a Cherokee elder living about 15 miles south of West Plains, a man named Samuel Swimmer, who was known as a keeper of traditional knowledge. He was said to be nearly 90 years old, one of the last living links to the time before the Cherokee removal, the forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears that had driven most of the Cherokee people from the southeast to Oklahoma in the late 1830s. Swimmer had been born in the Ozarks and had never left, living a quiet life on a small farm, practicing the old ways and maintaining the knowledge that had been passed to him by his elders. He rarely spoke with white visitors, Mrs. Hardesty warned, but Arterbury was welcome to try. On November 23rd, Arterbury rode out to Samuel Swimmer's property, a modest farm in a valley carved by a clear, cold stream. The farmhouse was small but well-maintained, with a large garden plot behind it, dormant now in the late autumn, but showing signs of careful cultivation. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in the yard. An old man sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket despite the mildness of the day. His face was deeply lined, his long hair completely white, but his eyes were sharp and alert as he watched Arterbury approach. Arterbury dismounted and approached the porch respectfully, removing his hat. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Samuel Arterbury. I am a surveyor working in the region, and I am conducting research into the cave systems of the Ozarks. Mrs. Hardesty in West Plains suggested that you might be willing to speak with me about the traditional knowledge of this area." The old man studied him for a long moment without speaking. Then he gestured to a chair on the porch. "Sit," he said. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying an accent that Arterbury could not quite place. Arterbury sat, and for several minutes, neither man spoke. The silence stretched, and Arterbury resisted the urge to fill it with nervous conversation. He sensed that this was some form of test or assessment, that Samuel Swimmer was taking his measure before deciding whether to engage with him. Finally, Swimmer spoke. "You have been in the deep caves," he said. It was not a question but a statement. "You have seen the Nunnehi." Arterbury felt his pulse quicken. The Nunnehi. It was the first time he had heard a name applied to the Orbs, the first indication that they were part of a known tradition. "I have seen something in the caves," he said carefully, "spheres of light moving with apparent purpose. I do not know what they are, but I wish to understand them." Swimmer nodded slowly. "The Nunnehi he repeated. The word means those who live anywhere in your language. They are the ancient ones, the people who were here before people, who live in the places between earth and sky, between water and stone. They are especially found in the deep caves, where they have lived since the beginning of time. Arterbury withdrew his notebook slowly, not wanting to appear presumptuous. May I record what you tell me? This knowledge is precious, and I want to preserve it accurately. Swimmer considered this, then nodded. You may write. But understand that what I tell you is not merely information to be collected and analyzed. It is sacred knowledge passed down through many generations. You must treat it with respect. I will, Arterbury promised. Please tell me about the Nunnehi. Over the next several hours, as the afternoon light faded and Swimmer's wife brought them coffee and corn cakes, the old Cherokee shared knowledge that had been preserved in his family for generations beyond counting. Arterbury wrote frantically, filling page after page of his notebook with what might be the most extraordinary interview of his life. According to Swimmer, the Nunnehi were spirit beings who existed in a realm that intersected with, but was not quite the same as the physical world. They could manifest in various forms, but they were most commonly encountered as lights, glowing orbs that moved through the air with intelligence and purpose. They lived primarily in deep caves, in the hearts of mountains, and near certain bodies of water, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. The Nunnehi were generally benevolent toward humans, Swimmer explained, or at least indifferent. They were not gods or demons, but something else entirely, beings of a different order of existence. They had been present in the world since its creation, and they would remain long after humans had passed from the earth. Time moved differently for them. What seemed like moments to the Nunnehi might be years to humans, and vice versa. In the old days, Swimmer said, before the white people came, before even my ancestors came to these mountains, there were those who knew how to communicate with the Nunnehi. Medicine people, seers, those with special knowledge. They could enter the deep caves and speak with the Nunnehi, learning secrets of the earth and sky. Some of this knowledge was good, useful for healing, and for understanding the world. Some of it was dangerous, things humans were not meant to know. Arterbury leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. How did they communicate? How is it possible to speak with beings of light? Swimmer smiled faintly. Not with words, he said. The Nunnehi do not speak as we speak. They communicate through resonance, through harmony. Sound is important. Certain tones, certain rhythms, these can bridge the gap between their world and ours. Those who knew the old songs could call the Nunnehi forth, could ask them questions, could receive visions and knowledge. This aligned perfectly with Arterbury's observations of the Orbs' responses to sound, particularly to musical tones. He described his experiments, how the Orbs had reacted to his humming, how a particular pitch had caused them all to move in coordination. Swimmer nodded, as if this was exactly what he expected. You found one of the resonant frequencies, he said. There are many such frequencies, each one creating a different response, a different form of communication. The old songs incorporated these frequencies, using them to create specific effects. A song to call the Nunnehi, a song to ask for guidance. A song to thank them for their presence, a song to ask them to depart. Do you know these songs? Arterbury asked. hardly daring to hope. Swimmer shook his head slowly. Most of them are lost. My grandfather knew some, and he taught me fragments, but the full knowledge died with the old medicine people. The forced removal scattered our people, broke the lines of transmission. Much was lost, but he did remember one song or part of one. With Arterbury's notebook ready, Swimmer began to sing in a thin, wavering voice, his eyes closed, drawing up memory from deep wells of the past. The melody was simple, haunting, consisting of only 5 or 6 notes repeated in varying patterns. He sang for perhaps 2 minutes, then stopped. "That is a calling song," he said. "It asks the Nunnehi to make themselves known, to come forth and be seen. I do not know if it still works. I have never been to the deep caves where the Nunnehi dwell. I am too old now for such journeys." Arterbury had attempted to transcribe the melody, marking the pitches and rhythms as best he could in musical notation. He was not trained in music and doubted his transcription was entirely accurate, but it was better than nothing. He felt an overwhelming urge to rush back to the caves immediately and test whether this song would produce the effect Swimmer described, but he restrained himself. There was more to learn here. "The ancient carvings I found in the caves," he said. "Symbols and images of the Orbs, the Nunnehi, who made those?" Swimmer shrugged. "Many peoples have lived in these mountains over the millennia. The Cherokee are relative newcomers. We arrived here perhaps 1,000 years ago, fleeing conflicts in the east, but there were others before us. The Osage, the Quapaw, and before them, peoples whose names are forgotten, who left only their stone works and their mounds. Any of them might have made the carvings you found. The Nunnehi have been in these caves since the beginning. Every people who have come here have known of them, have marked their presence in stone and story." "Are they dangerous?" Arterbury asked. "I attempted to capture one to study it, and it reacted with great force, great speed. I do not wish to anger them or bring harm to myself through ignorance." Swimmer's expression became serious. "They can be dangerous if provoked, if disrespected. They do not like to be trapped or constrained. They value their freedom above all else. But if you approach them with respect, with humility, if you do not try to possess or control them, they will tolerate your presence. They may even share knowledge with you, though you must be prepared to receive it in forms you do not expect." "What kind of knowledge?" Arterbury pressed. "What have they shared with humans in the past?" "Knowledge of the earth," Swimmer said. "Knowledge of time, of the deep patterns that govern the world. Those who learned from the Nunnehi often became great healers, because the Nunnehi understand the hidden properties of stones and plants and waters. They also understand the movements of energy through the earth, the currents and flows that create life and shape the land. Some who sought this knowledge became powerful. Others went mad, unable to integrate what they learned with their human understanding." This last statement sent a chill through Arterbury. He had already felt his rational worldview straining under the weight of what he had observed. If he pursued this investigation to its conclusion, if he truly sought to understand the Nunnehi on their own terms rather than through the inadequate lens of 19th century science, might he too risk his sanity? But even as the thought formed, he knew he could not turn back. The mystery had claimed him. He would see it through, whatever the cost. He spent the remainder of the afternoon with Samuel Swimmer, filling his notebook with every fragment of knowledge, every story, every detail the old man could recall. He learned that certain caves were considered particularly sacred, places where the Nunnehi were most concentrated and most accessible. He learned that the full moon was considered an auspicious time for attempting contact, when the boundaries between worlds were thinnest. He learned that offerings were traditionally made before entering the deep caves, tobacco or cornmeal scattered at the entrance as a gesture of respect. As the sun set and Arterbury prepared to leave, Swimmer gave him a final warning. "The Nunnehi are not human," he said. "Do not make the mistake of thinking they are like us, that they want what we want or think as we think. They are other, fundamentally other. If you seek to understand them, you must be willing to accept that some things cannot be translated into human terms, cannot be grasped by human minds. You must be willing to stand at the edge of mystery and accept that you may never cross to the other side." Arterbury thanked him profusely, offering payment which Swimmer refused. "The knowledge is not mine to sell," the old man said. "It belongs to the people, to the land, to the Nunnehi themselves. I have shared it with you because I believe you will treat it with respect. Do not make me regret this trust." "I will not," Arterbury promised. And with that, he rode back toward West Plains through the gathering darkness, his mind reeling with everything he had learned. The encounter with Samuel Swimmer had transformed Arterbury's investigation. What had been a purely scientific inquiry, an attempt to explain an anomalous natural phenomenon, had become something far more complex. He was now dealing with something that indigenous tradition classified as spiritual, as beings that existed in a different category of reality than the rocks and gases and organisms he had been trained to study. The question that haunted him as he rode through the dark was whether the traditional knowledge Swimmer had shared represented actual understanding of the orb's true nature, or whether it was merely a different kind of interpretation. A spiritual explanation layered over phenomena that might ultimately have a purely physical basis. But the more he considered his observations, the more he felt that the traditional explanation might actually be more accurate than the scientific one. The orbs behaved in ways that suggested consciousness, awareness, intention. They responded to sound in sophisticated ways. They coordinated their actions across entire populations. They had persisted for millennia if the archaeological evidence could be trusted. Perhaps the mistake was trying to force them into the categories of conventional science. Perhaps they genuinely were something other, something that required a different framework of understanding altogether. Over the next week, Arterbury prepared for his return to the caves. He purchased supplies for an extended stay, including a better quality of candles, more rope, additional notebooks, and warmer clothing for the deep chambers. He also acquired a small wooden flute from a music shop in West Plains, thinking that if the Nunnehi responded to musical tones, he should have a better means of producing them than his own uncertain humming. He practiced the song fragment that Swimmer had taught him, playing it on the flute over and over until he had memorized it completely. The melody was simple but haunting, and he found himself playing it at odd moments throughout the day, the notes running through his mind like a mantra. On December 1st, 1889, Samuel Arterbury returned to the cave site. Winter was settling over the Ozarks, and the forest had transformed in his absence. The trees stood bare, their leaves fallen to carpet the forest floor in shades of brown and gold. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the promise of snow. The sinkhole entrance was exactly as he had left it, his cached supplies undisturbed. He spent the afternoon setting up a more permanent camp near the cave entrance, building a small shelter from canvas and fallen timber that would protect him from the winter weather. As the sun set, he built a fire and prepared himself mentally for the descent he would make the following morning. That night, he had vivid dreams of the orbs, of drifting through the phosphorescent chambers as if he himself were one of them, seeing the world from their perspective. In the dream, he understood that time moved differently in the deep caves, that days and years blurred together, that the orbs experienced existence as a long, slow flow, punctuated by brief moments of interaction with the rapid, chaotic world of human time. He woke before dawn with the dream still vivid in his mind, wondering if it was merely his subconscious processing the information Swimmer had shared, or whether it was something more, a genuine glimpse into the nature of the Nunnehi. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees, Arterbury descended into the caves once more. He carried tobacco and cornmeal, as Swimmer had suggested, and at the entrance to the first deep chamber, he scattered both as offerings, speaking aloud a simple request for permission to enter and observe. The chamber was as he remembered it, the ambient phosphorescence casting everything in that characteristic blue-green twilight. And the orbs were there, dozens of them, drifting through their ancient patterns. He felt a surge of relief and something deeper, a sense of homecoming, as if he had been away from the place he truly belonged. He settled into his accustomed observation point and withdrew his flute. Taking a deep breath, he began to play the song that Samuel Swimmer had taught him, the calling song of the Nunnehi. The response was immediate and dramatic. Every orb in the chamber stopped its movement simultaneously. For a long moment, they hung motionless in the air, and Arterbury held his breath, the flute falling silent. Then, slowly, they began to move again, but not in their usual random patterns. They were converging, gathering together in the center of the chamber, clustering into a larger formation. Arterbury watched in awe as the orbs assembled themselves into what appeared to be a structured arrangement, larger orbs at the center, smaller ones orbiting around them in layers, the entire formation pulsing gently in synchronized rhythm. It looked organic, like a cell or an organism, or perhaps like a miniature model of a solar system, spheres orbiting spheres in harmonious motion. The formation held for perhaps 5 minutes, and then, as if responding to some unheard signal, the orbs dispersed, flowing back to their individual positions and patterns. But something had changed. Several orbs approached Arterbury more closely than they ever had before, coming to within 3 feet of where he sat. They hovered there, pulsing gently, and he had the unmistakable sensation that he was being examined, assessed, acknowledged. He played the song again, and again the orbs formed their structured pattern. When he stopped playing, they dispersed. He had found a key, a way to communicate that went beyond mere observation. The song created a response, a specific, reproducible behavior that suggested genuine understanding. Over the next several days, Arterbury experimented with the song, playing it at different times, in different chambers, observing the variations in response. He discovered that the orbs in different chambers responded slightly differently, as if they were distinct communities with their own variations on the basic pattern. In the main chamber, they formed the orbital structure he had first observed. In a smaller chamber to the west, they formed a vertical column, stacking themselves one above another. In the large chamber that contained over 50 orbs, they formed an intricate spiral pattern, like a galaxy viewed from above. Each pattern was beautiful, mathematical in its precision, and utterly unlike anything Arterbury had ever witnessed. He sketched them obsessively, filling pages with drawings of the formations, trying to capture their geometry and movement. He also began to notice something else. When the orbs were in these formation patterns, the ambient phosphorescence of the chamber would intensify. The sourceless glow that pervaded the space would brighten noticeably, and Arterbury would feel a change in the air, a kind of charged stillness, as if the atmosphere itself was responding to the orb's coordinated activity. During one of these moments, on December 7th, Arterbury experienced something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He had been playing the calling song, and the orbs had formed their pattern when suddenly he felt a shift in his consciousness, a subtle but distinct alteration in his perception. The chamber seemed to expand around him, growing larger and deeper. The walls receded into infinite distance, and he felt as if he were floating in a vast, luminous space. The orbs were no longer separate objects, but nodes in a network of light, connected by invisible threads of energy that pulsed and flowed with living current. And he understood in that moment that he was seeing the world as the Nunnehi perceived it, not as discrete objects in empty space, but as patterns of energy and resonance, everything connected, everything part of a larger harmonic structure. The distinction between himself and the orbs blurred. He felt their ancient presence, their patient observation of the world's slow changes, their existence outside the frantic rush of human time. The experience lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt both instantaneous and eternal. When his normal perception returned, he found himself trembling, tears running down his face, overwhelmed by what he had just experienced. It was not frightening exactly, but it was profoundly disorienting, a glimpse of a mode of existence so different from his own that he struggled to integrate it with his sense of self. He understood now what Samuel Swimmer had meant about the danger of this knowledge. To truly understand the Nunnehi, one had to be willing to let go of human perspective, to experience reality in a fundamentally different way. And once you had experienced that, once you had felt the boundaries of your individual consciousness dissolve into something larger, it became difficult to return fully to the limited, separate mode of human awareness. Arterbury spent the next 2 months in and around the caves, alternating between periods of intense observation and periods of rest and integration on the surface. He filled notebook after notebook with his findings, developing what he began to call the resonance theory of the Nunnehi. According to this theory, the orbs were not objects in the conventional sense, but rather stable patterns of energy that organized themselves according to harmonic principles. They existed at the intersection of the physical and the spiritual, drawing their sustaining energy from deep geological processes, the piezoelectric effects of stressed quartz, the Earth's magnetic field, the subtle flows of telluric current through the rock, but organizing that energy according to principles that transcended mere physics. They were in some sense alive, though not in the biological sense. They possessed awareness, though not consciousness as humans experienced it. They existed in time, but perceived it differently than temporal beings, experiencing the flow of years as humans might experience the flow of hours. The caves where they dwelt were not merely their habitat, but part of their being. The limestone chambers, carved over millions of years by water, created acoustic and energetic conditions that sustained the orb's existence. The quartz veins in the surrounding rock acted as energy conduits, feeding power into the system. The deep stillness of the caves, isolated from the chaos of the surface world, provided the stability necessary for the orb's delicate resonant patterns to persist. And humans, when they entered these chambers with the right intentions and the right understanding, could interact with the orbs through sound and resonance, could glimpse the harmonic structure of reality that the orbs embodied, could touch, however briefly, the eternal present in which the Nunnehi existed. It was a theory that combined physics, metaphysics, indigenous wisdom, and Arterbury's own direct experience. It satisfied him in ways that purely materialist explanations had not. Whether it was objectively true, whether it would withstand scientific scrutiny, he could not say, but it felt true. It honored the complexity of what he had observed while acknowledging the limits of human understanding. In February of 1890, Samuel Arterbury's extended contract with the Missouri Mineral Exploration Company came to an end. The company, satisfied with his reports on the geological unsuitability of the region for large-scale mining operations, released him from his obligations. He was free to pursue other work, to move on to new surveys in different regions. But Arterbury did not leave the Ozarks. He had abandoned any pretense of continuing his career as a conventional surveyor. The mystery of the Nunnehi had consumed him completely. He took a room in West Plains and began making plans for a more systematic, long-term study of the phenomenon. He needed funding, equipment, and ideally credible witnesses who could confirm his observations. He began reaching out to scientific institutions, writing careful letters to geologists, physicists, and naturalists, describing what he had found in measured, conservative terms. He avoided mentioning the more mystical or metaphysical aspects of his experiences, focusing instead on the observable physical phenomena, the lights, their movements, their responses to sound. The responses he received were uniformly discouraging. Most of his letters went unanswered. Those scientists who did reply expressed polite skepticism or suggested that he had misidentified some conventional phenomenon. Ball lightning was mentioned frequently, as were various types of bioluminescence. Several correspondents suggested, more or less tactfully, that prolonged isolation in dark caves might have affected his perceptions and judgment. No one offered funding. No one volunteered to visit the site and observe the orbs firsthand. The scientific establishment of 1890 had no framework for incorporating phenomena like the Nunnehi into its understanding of the natural world, and so it simply dismissed them as misidentification, delusion, or fraud. Frustrated but undeterred, Arterbury decided to continue his research independently. He had some savings from his years of survey work, enough to sustain a modest existence for a year or two. He would document the orbs as thoroughly as possible, gather every scrap of evidence he could, and eventually, he hoped, the weight of that evidence would compel the scientific community to take him seriously. Throughout the spring and summer of 1890, he maintained a rigorous schedule of observations, descending into the caves several times each week, each visit lasting 8 to 12 hours. He began bringing primitive photographic equipment into the caves, heavy glass plates, and cumbersome cameras, hoping to capture images of the orbs that could serve as objective evidence of their existence. The photographic experiments were largely unsuccessful. The orb's light was sufficient for human vision, but too dim and diffuse to register clearly on the slow, insensitive photographic plates available in that era. The few images he did capture showed only vague, blurry glows that could easily be dismissed as equipment malfunctions or processing errors. Photography, he concluded, was not yet advanced enough to document the phenomenon adequately. He had better success with detailed physical measurements. He created careful maps of the cave system, documenting the locations and sizes of all the chambers where orbs were present. He recorded the ambient temperature and humidity in each chamber, looking for correlations with orb activity. He documented the locations of quartz veins and other geological features, testing his theory about energy sources. He also continued his experiments with sound and resonance. Beyond the calling song that Samuel Swimmer had taught him, he began experimenting with other musical tones and patterns, playing his flute in various keys and modes, observing how the orbs responded to different frequencies and rhythms. He discovered that certain tones caused the orbs to cluster together, while others caused them to disperse. Some frequencies seemed to agitate them, causing rapid pulsing and erratic movement, while others calmed them, slowing their movements to an almost meditative drift. Musical intervals seemed particularly significant. Perfect fifths and octaves produced harmonious responses, with multiple orbs pulsing in synchronization. Minor seconds and tritones produced discordant responses, with the orbs retreating or dimming their lights. Arterbury began to think of his flute as a tool of communication, a way to ask questions and receive answers through the orb's behavioral responses. It was not language in the conventional sense, but it was exchange, interaction, a form of dialogue between human and Nunnehi consciousness. In September of 1890, nearly a year after his initial discovery, Arterbury made another significant find. While exploring a side passage in one of the deeper chambers, a narrow, low tunnel he had previously dismissed as too small to be worth investigating, he discovered that it opened, after about 50 feet of tight crawling, into a small chamber unlike any he had seen before. This chamber was perfectly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose perhaps 15 feet at its center. The walls were smooth, almost polished, with none of the rough, irregular texture of natural limestone. The floor was level and covered with fine white sand that showed no signs of water deposition or the footprints of animals. And in the exact center of the chamber, resting on the sand, was a stone. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a human head, 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Its surface was smooth but not polished, with a texture like that of the orbs he had been observing. It was made of quartz, but not the cloudy white quartz he had found in veins throughout the cave system. This was clear quartz, transparent as glass, and it seemed to glow faintly from within with the same blue-green light that characterized the orbs. Arterbury approached the stone slowly, his heart pounding. He had the strong sense that he had found something significant, something central to the mystery he had been investigating. The chamber felt different from the others, charged with a kind of potential energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. He knelt beside the stone and examined it closely without touching it. The internal glow was not uniform. It seemed to pulse gently, in rhythm with the pulsations of the orbs that drifted in the larger chambers beyond. Looking closely, he could see structures within the crystal, geometric patterns and formations that might be natural inclusions or might be something else entirely. When he finally worked up the courage to touch the stone, placing his palm gently on its surface, he felt a vibration, a subtle thrumming energy that seemed to resonate through his hand and up his arm. The sensation was not unpleasant, but it was decidedly strange, as if the stone were alive in some sense, or at least active with some form of energy that his nerves could detect. As he knelt there with his hand on the stone, the light within it brightened noticeably, and he heard or felt a sound like a distant bell, a pure, clear tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In the passages beyond the small chamber, he heard a response, a chorus of similar tones, and moments later, orbs began to enter the circular chamber, drifting through the narrow entrance passage with difficulty, clustering around the central stone. Within minutes, the chamber was filled with orbs, more concentrated than he had ever seen them. They orbited the central stone in layers, creating a spherical formation with the stone at its core. The light became so intense that Arterbury had to squint against the glare. The sound, that bell-like tone, grew louder, resonating in his bones, vibrating through his entire body. And then, for the second time in his investigation, his consciousness shifted. The boundaries of his individual awareness dissolved, and he felt himself expanding, merging with the larger pattern of energy and resonance that filled the chamber. He was the stone, ancient and patient, a focal point for forces that flowed through the earth. He was the orbs, eternal dancers in the darkness, aware and alive in ways that transcended human categories. He was the cave itself, the hollow spaces in the rock, shaped by water and time, resonating with the deep song of the planet. How long this experience lasted, he could not say. It might have been seconds or hours. But when his normal consciousness returned, he found himself lying on the sand beside the stone, drained and trembling. The orbs had dispersed, returned to the outer chambers. The stone's internal light had dimmed to its previous faint glow. Everything was as it had been, except for Arterbury himself, who felt fundamentally altered by what he had experienced. He understood now that the stone was not merely an unusual mineral formation. It was a nexus, a focusing point for the energies that sustained the Nunnehi. It might even be, in some sense, the source from which the orbs emerged, or the anchor that kept them tethered to this particular location. The perfectly circular chamber was not a natural formation, but had been shaped, whether by human hands or by the Nunnehi themselves, or by some combination of both, to house this central stone. This discovery gave Arterbury's resonance theory a concrete foundation. The stone was a physical object that could be studied, measured, documented. It provided evidence that the phenomenon was not merely subjective experience or misperception, but was rooted in material reality, even if that reality operated according to principles that conventional science had not yet discovered. Over the next several months, Arterbury spent considerable time in the circular chamber, studying the stone from every angle, documenting its properties, attempting to understand its role in the larger system of the Nunnehi. He brought his compass and discovered that the stone affected it strongly, deflecting the needle in ways that suggested powerful magnetic properties. He brought his thermometer and found that the area immediately around the stone was slightly warmer than the rest of the cave, perhaps by 2 or 3 degrees, suggesting that it was radiating energy in the form of heat as well as light. He tried playing his flute in the circular chamber and discovered that the acoustics were extraordinary. Notes resonated and sustained far longer than they should in a space of that size, and certain frequencies seemed to amplify, growing louder rather than fading. When he played the calling song in this chamber, the response from the orbs was overwhelming, with dozens pouring into the space until they completely filled it, their combined light bright enough to read by. But he was careful not to disturb the stone itself, not to attempt to move it or alter it in any way. His experience with trying to capture an orb had taught him the danger of attempting to possess or control the Nunnehi. The stone was where it was for a reason, serving a purpose that was central to the phenomenon. To interfere with it might destroy the delicate balance that allowed the orbs to exist. As 1890 drew to a close and 1891 began, Arterbury's financial resources were running low. His savings were nearly exhausted, and he had no income beyond occasional odd jobs in West Plains, repair work and carpentry that brought in barely enough to pay for his room and basic necessities. He was forced to make difficult decisions about the future of his research. He could not afford to continue his full-time investigation of the caves indefinitely. He would need to find regular employment, which would drastically reduce the time available for his studies of the Nunnehi. But the thought of abandoning the research, of leaving the mystery unsolved, was unbearable. The caves and their luminous inhabitants had become the center of his existence, the only thing that gave his life meaning and purpose. In the spring of 1891, he found a compromise solution. A wealthy landowner named Thomas Beckworth, who owned extensive property in the region, hired Arterbury as a caretaker and general manager for his holdings. The work was not demanding, primarily involving periodic inspections of the property boundaries, basic maintenance of fences and roads, and oversight of tenant farmers. It provided a modest but reliable income, and crucially, it allowed Arterbury considerable freedom to continue his cave investigations in his spare time. He would maintain this arrangement for the next 16 years, balancing his official duties with his unofficial obsession, descending into the caves whenever his responsibilities allowed, continuing to document the Nunnehi, continuing to seek understanding of their nature and significance. Over those years, his journals accumulated into a substantial archive, dozens of volumes filled with observations, theories, sketches, and philosophical reflections. He documented seasonal variations in the orbs' behavior, noting that they seemed more active during certain times of year, particularly around the equinoxes. He documented weather-related patterns, observing that the orb's light intensity often increased before thunderstorms, suggesting a response to changes in atmospheric pressure or electromagnetic conditions. He brought other people into the caves on several occasions, hoping to find witnesses who could corroborate his observations. Some saw the orbs and were as amazed as he had been. Others claimed to see nothing unusual, only darkness and the vague phosphorescence of the walls. He concluded that the ability to perceive the Nunnehi might vary from person to person, that some individuals might lack the perceptual sensitivity required to detect them. But despite his efforts, he never succeeded in convincing any credible scientist to take his findings seriously. The few academics he managed to interest enough to visit the site were either unable to perceive the orbs, or, if they did see them, explain them away as familiar phenomena misidentified due to the disorienting conditions of the deep caves. Arterbury's reputation in the scientific community, such as it was, gradually shifted from respected surveyor to eccentric obsessive to likely crank. Letters he sent to scientific journals were rejected. Manuscripts he prepared were returned unread. He became known, in the small circles where he was known at all, as the Cave Light Man, a cautionary tale about what happened when isolation and obsession overcame rational judgment. This isolation and dismissal took a toll on him. His journals from the late 1890s and early 1900s show increasing frustration and bitterness, anger at the scientific establishment for its refusal to seriously investigate his claims, resentment at the ridicule he sometimes faced from those who heard of his work. But they also show a deepening connection with the Nunnehi themselves, a sense that even if the human world rejected and dismissed him, he had found something of greater value in the phosphorescent depths. He wrote less about trying to prove the existence of the orbs and more about understanding them on their own terms, accepting them as they were rather than trying to force them into human categories of explanation. His later journals read almost like spiritual texts, meditations on the nature of consciousness and existence, reflections on what it meant to encounter intelligence so fundamentally different from human intelligence. In 1905, at the age of 62, Arterbury's health began to fail. Years of spending long hours in the cold, damp environment of the caves had taken their toll. He developed a persistent cough that would not resolve, and he lost weight steadily. A doctor in West Plains diagnosed chronic bronchitis and urged him to avoid further exposure to the cave environment, but Arterbury ignored this advice. The caves had become more important to him than his own health. His final journal entries, written in early 1907, show a man who knew he was approaching the end of his life and who had made peace with the fact that he would die without having solved the mystery that had consumed him. But they also show a man who did not regret the path he had chosen, who felt privileged to have encountered the Nunnehi, who believed that the experience of mystery was itself valuable, even in the absence of complete understanding. On March 14, 1907, Samuel Arterbury was found dead in his room in West Plains. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia complicated by chronic respiratory disease. He was 64 years old. He left no family, no heirs, and few friends. His landlord inventoried his possessions, which consisted primarily of clothes, basic furnishings, surveying equipment, and dozens of notebooks filled with writings about luminous spheres in caves. The notebooks were packed into crates and stored in the basement of the courthouse, where they remained for decades, forgotten and unread. Arterbury's grave in the West Plains Cemetery was marked with a simple stone that recorded only his name and dates, with no mention of the obsession that had defined the last 18 years of his life. The cave where he had discovered the Nunnehi was not documented in any official record. Arterbury had deliberately kept its exact location secret, recording it in his private journals, but never marking it on any map that would be filed with county or state authorities. He had wanted to protect the Nunnehi from intrusion, from the curiosity seekers and exploiters who might damage or destroy the delicate conditions that allowed them to exist. And so the location was lost. After Arterbury's death, no one knew where to find the phosphorescent chambers and their luminous inhabitants. The few people who had visited the caves with him either could not remember the route or had no interest in returning. The Nunnehi returned to their ancient obscurity, drifting through the darkness unseen and unknown, as they had for millennia before Samuel Arterbury stumbled into their realm. For nearly a century, Arterbury's work remained forgotten, buried in the courthouse basement, unknown even to local historians. The story of the cave lights faded into vague local folklore, just another strange tale among the many strange tales that accumulated around the Ozark caves. But in 2003, during a renovation of the West Plains courthouse, the crates containing Arterbury's journals were discovered. A local history enthusiast named Jennifer Morrison began the painstaking work of transcribing and organizing the deteriorating notebooks. And as she did so, the extraordinary scope of Arterbury's investigation became apparent. Morrison published excerpts from the journals in regional history magazines and presented papers about Arterbury's work at local historical societies. This brought the story to wider attention, and eventually it reached people with the resources and motivation to follow up on it. In 2011, a team of cavers and researchers working from clues in Arterbury's journals began a systematic search for the cave system he had described. Using modern cave survey techniques and LiDAR mapping technology, they identified several promising locations in the region where Arterbury had worked, areas with extensive karst development and multiple sinkhole entrances. After 3 years of exploration, in the summer of 2014, they found it. A sinkhole entrance matching Arterbury's description, leading to a series of chambers that corresponded to his maps and sketches. And in the deepest chamber they explored, they found the phosphorescent glow he had described, the sourceless blue-green luminescence that pervaded the space. And they saw the orbs. The modern explorers documented them with high-resolution video cameras and digital photography, capturing clear images that Arterbury could never have achieved with the primitive equipment of his era. The footage shows exactly what Arterbury described: spheres of light 8 to 10 inches in diameter, drifting through the chamber with purposeful movement, responding to sound, clustering and dispersing in coordinated patterns. The discovery created a minor sensation in caving and scientific communities. Research teams from several universities visited the site, bringing sophisticated instruments to study the phenomenon. Spectrometers analyzed the light spectrum emitted by the orbs. Magnetometers detected unusual electromagnetic fluctuations in the chambers. Geologists studied the rock formations and mineral content, looking for clues to the orb's energy source. The circular chamber, with its central quartz stone, was found exactly where Arterbury had described it, and it became a focus of intense study. The stone was analyzed with ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques, revealing complex internal structures that seemed to be partly natural crystal formation and partly something else, geometric patterns too regular to be entirely natural. But despite all the modern technology and scientific expertise brought to bear on the phenomenon, the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. The orbs exist. They can be documented and studied. But what they are, what sustains them, why they behave as they do, these questions remain unanswered. Some researchers favor explanations based on exotic physics, involving plasma phenomena, electromagnetic field interactions, or quantum effects in the crystalline structures of the rock. Others lean toward biological explanations, proposing unknown organisms or symbiotic colonies that have evolved bioluminescence and collective behavior to extraordinary degrees. Still others suggest that the orbs might be related to ball lightning or other atmospheric electrical phenomena, sustained by unusual geological conditions in the cave. But no single explanation has gained consensus, and none fully accounts for all the observed properties of the orbs. They remain, as they were for Samuel Arterbury, a genuine mystery, a phenomenon that exists at the boundaries of current scientific understanding. The cave is now protected as a scientific research site, with access strictly controlled to prevent damage to the delicate environment. Only authorized researchers are permitted to enter, and they must follow strict protocols to minimize their impact. The orbs continue their ancient dance in the darkness, observed now by scientists with instruments Arterbury could never have imagined, but still fundamentally unexplained. Samuel Arterbury's journals have been fully transcribed and published, making his observations available to modern researchers. His resonance theory, while not expressed in modern scientific terminology, has influenced some of the current research directions, particularly investigations into the role of sound and electromagnetic frequencies in the orb's behavior. There has been discussion of renaming the cave system the Arterbury Caverns in his honor, recognition of his pioneering documentation of the phenomenon. But this has met resistance from some quarters, particularly from indigenous groups who point out that the Nunnehi were known to their ancestors long before Arterbury encountered them, and that any naming should acknowledge this deeper history. The debate over what to call the caves reflects larger questions about how we understand and categorize phenomena that don't fit neatly into established frameworks. Are the orbs primarily a scientific phenomenon that should be studied with instruments and experiments? Are they a spiritual phenomenon that should be approached with reverence and respect for traditional knowledge? Can they be both? How do we integrate indigenous wisdom with scientific methodology? These questions remain unresolved, and perhaps they should remain unresolved. Perhaps the value of the Nunnehi, as Samuel Arterbury came to believe in his final years, lies not in explaining them, but in experiencing them, in allowing ourselves to stand in the presence of genuine mystery and accept that some things transcend our categories and our understanding. What we know with certainty is that in the deep caves beneath the Ozark Plateau, in chambers carved by water over millions of years, luminous spheres drift through the darkness as they have for uncounted centuries. They respond to sound with coordinated grace. They gather around a central stone that glows with captured energy. They persist, patient and eternal, indifferent to human theories and human needs for explanation. They are the Nunnehi, the ones who live anywhere, the ancient presences that dwell in the spaces between earth and sky, between matter and energy, between the known and the unknowable. Samuel Arterbury devoted his life to understanding them and died with the mystery unsolved. But in failing to explain them, he succeeded in documenting them, in preserving knowledge of their existence, in ensuring that future generations would know that these wonders exist in the hidden places of the world. His legacy is not a solution, but a question, not an answer, but an invitation to wonder. And perhaps that is the most valuable legacy any explorer can leave: the knowledge that mysteries remain, that the world is stranger and more wonderful than our theories encompass, that in the darkness beneath our feet, light still dance to rhythms we have yet to comprehend. The orbs drift on through the phosphorescent chambers, glowing with their ancient light, holding their secrets close, waiting for the next curious mind that will descend into their realm and attempt, as Arterbury did, to bridge the gap between human understanding and the eternal mystery of the Nunnehi. And in that waiting, in that patient persistence through the ages, they offer us something precious, proof that wonder still exists in the world, that genuine mystery endures, that not everything has been explained or categorized or reduced to data points in a spreadsheet. They remind us that to be human is to stand at the edge of the unknown and choose, each day, whether to retreat to comfortable certainty or to descend into the darkness in search of light. Samuel Arterbury made his choice. He descended. And what he found there changed him forever, transformed him from a surveyor of land into a surveyor of mystery, from a measurer of surfaces into a seeker of depths. His journals end not with conclusions, but with questions, not with certainty, but with awe. And that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. The mystery endures. The lights still glow in the Ozark abyss. And somewhere in the darkness, the Nunnehi continue their ancient dance, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out, to sit in the phosphorescent chambers and witness wonders that defy explanation. They are there still. They have always been there. They will be there long after we are gone, eternal presences in the heart of the mountain, glowing softly in the dark, holding their secrets, offering their silent invitation to mystery. This is the legacy of Samuel Arterbury, not answers, but better questions, not explanation, but documentation of the unexplainable. Not mastery over mystery, but humble acknowledgement of its persistence and power. And in the end, perhaps that is enough.